the summer of 1972, physicist John Eddy climbed a ridge in Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains carrying instruments built for studying the sun. 9,600 feet up, on ground the Crow had visited for generations, he found a stone wheel with 28 spokes. He sighted across it toward the horizon. The line was too precise to be an accident. Someone had built this on purpose, and no one could say who. How does a monument with no writing and no known engineers achieve that kind of accuracy? Why place it where snow buries it 9 months a year? And why did scientists study it for 70 years without seeing what it was for? This was not a burial marker. It was something closer to an instrument, and no one has ever proven who built it, or when. What follows weighs the stones themselves against the written record and against Crow oral tradition that named this place long before science understood it. Before any of this had a name in scientific literature, the site was already old beyond memory for the region's native nations, sitting on a high alpine plateau within the Bighorn Mountains of north-central Wyoming, an area the Crow, along with several neighboring nations, had used for centuries. The wheel is built from local white limestone, laid directly onto a bed of the same stone, roughly 80 feet across, its ring interrupted by a scatter of smaller stone piles and completed by a single larger cairn near the center, about 12 feet wide. None of this was recorded by outsiders until 1895, when a hunter named Paul Frank, chasing game through the range, stumbled onto the wheel and described it briefly in an article for the magazine Forest and Stream. His account treated it as an oddity worth a few paragraphs, nothing more. A strange stone pattern on a mountain almost nobody outside the region had reason to climb. For years afterward it circulated only as rumor among hunters, ranchers and surveyors passing through the Bighorns, unverified by anyone with scientific training. The Bighorn wheel is not unique in kind. Researchers have since identified more than 100 similar stone formations scattered across Montana, the Dakotas, Wyoming and the Canadian provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan, some of them, north of the border, far older than anything found on the American side. What sets this particular wheel apart is its size, its condition, and the fact that it became the first of these formations to draw the attention of professional science at all. Long before that attention arrived, the plateau surrounding it was already understood by the region's native nations as part of a far larger sacred landscape, one that included the alpine forest around it, several nearby peaks, and travel routes worn into the mountainside by generations of foot traffic headed toward the same destination. That changed in 1902, when S.C. Sims, an ethnologist attached to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, made the climb up Medicine Mountain on the museum's behalf. Sims produced the first serious description of the wheel, its 28 spokes running from the central cairn to the rim and a ring of additional stone enclosures built along that rim, each one roughly large enough to hold a single-seated adult. He recognized these enclosures as fasting beds, structures associated across the northern plains with vision quests, and he noted that some still carried the remains of wooden covers built to shelter whoever occupied them through cold mountain nights. What Sims could not explain, and did not attempt to, was why anyone would build fasting stations on a summit that lies under snow for roughly 9 months of the year, reachable only through a narrow window in high summer. His report filed the wheel away as an ethnological curiosity, real, old, significant to the region's tribes, but functionally unexplained. The fasting practice Sims found evidence of was neither casual nor merely symbolic within the region's ceremonial life. Vision seekers across the northern plains commonly withdrew alone to a high, isolated place for 4 days at a stretch, taking neither food nor water, waiting for a vision that might arrive as an animal, a voice, or an instruction. The choice of location mattered a great deal in traditional belief. A place already understood to carry unusual spiritual power was thought to increase the likelihood that a vision would come at all. That the Medicine Wheel Plateau was chosen repeatedly by different individuals across different generations suggests its reputation for that kind of power predated any written account of it by a wide margin. The Crow had an answer of their own, though not the kind of answer a museum report could file under evidence. In their tradition, the wheel is called the Sun's Lodge, a name recorded when a Crow man named Flat Dog explained it to the anthropologist Robert Lowy, adding that generations of Crow people had fasted there and that the structure predated any memory anyone then living could account for. A second, more detailed tradition credits its construction to a young Crow man remembered as Burnt Face. As a boy, according to the story, he fell into a cooking fire and was left disfigured. Ashamed of his appearance, he withdrew from his people and climbed alone into the mountains, where a vision from the sun instructed him in what to build. Some versions of the story add that he was aided by the Little People, a race of small, powerful beings that recur throughout the oral traditions of several Plains nations. Having built the wheel, Burnt Face was healed and returned to his people restored. Other Crow accounts leave human hands out of the story altogether, holding that the sun let the wheel fall from the sky already whole. A third tradition, from the Shoshone, credits the wheel to the Sheep-Eaters, a Shoshone band known for hunting mountain sheep at high elevation year-round, living where few others could survive the climate. Blackfeet tradition preserves a strikingly similar account under a different name, describing a disfigured young man called Scarface, who traveled to the wheel in the distant past and returned from it transformed. The recurrence of nearly the same story, independently, in two different nations' oral traditions, is the kind of detail folklorists take seriously, not as proof of a single shared historical event, but as evidence that the site's association with healing and transformation ran deep and wide across the region, well beyond any one people's memory of it. These traditions do not agree with one another on who built the wheel, or how. What they agree on, without exception, is that its existence was never treated as ordinary. Real historical figures, whose lives are otherwise well documented, kept returning to the site long before any of this reached scientific literature. Crow oral history holds that the chief Plenty Coups fasted at the wheel, on one occasion accompanied by the Nez Perce leader, Chief Joseph, a man remembered for leading a desperate campaign toward Canada in 1877, and said to have returned to the mountains seeking healing years later while ill with tuberculosis. Plenty Coups himself was no minor figure. He would go on to become the last hereditary chief recognized by the Mountain Crow, and a prominent statesman in negotiations with the United States government, his standing rooted in part in the authority the wheel was believed to have granted him. The Eastern Shoshone chief Washakie is likewise said to have drawn much of his standing from time spent in prayer at the wheel. An earlier Crow chief, remembered as Red Plume and said to have lived during the era of Lewis and Clark, reportedly fasted there for 4 consecutive days without food or water, after which he was visited, according to the account passed down through his family, by the Little People, who told him that the eagle feather he wore marked him as protected. In 1921, the naturalist and anthropologist George Bird Grinnell carried out his own detailed survey of the wheel and the surrounding landscape, publishing his findings soon afterward. During his fieldwork, an elderly Cheyenne man named Elk River told him the wheel resembled the ceremonial lodge built for the Cheyenne sun dance, its 28 spokes echoing the 28 rafters used in that structure, a number that recurs across Plains ceremonial architecture and corresponds, not coincidentally, to the 28 days of the lunar cycle. Around the same period, other ethnographers recorded a Ponca chief describing the wheel in similar terms as a representation of a sun dance circle. Grinnell's report treated these comparisons seriously, and it went further than Sims had, connecting the wheel explicitly to solar ceremony rather than filing it away as an unexplained curiosity. It still left the deeper question untouched. If the number of spokes had been chosen deliberately to mean something about the sun and the calendar, had the wheel's builders arrived at that number through ceremony and instinct alone, or had they built it around knowledge of the sky precise enough to be tested? That test came 51 years later, and it did not come from an archaeologist. When John Eddy returned from his 1972 expedition, he did not publish quickly. He spent close to 2 years cross-checking his sightlines and consulting records of how the positions of stars shift over centuries, before submitting his findings to the journal Science, where they appeared under the title Astronomical Alignment of the Bighorn Medicine Wheel. His method was straightforward in principle and demanding in practice, standing at one cairn, used as a backsight, and looking toward a second, used as a foresight, to determine exactly which point on the horizon the line indicated. he found that a line from one cairn through the central cairn to another pointed with precision at the position where the sun rises on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. A separate pair of cairns marked, with similar precision, the point where the sun sets on that same day. 3 further cairn pairs he found, aligned not with the sun but with the horizon points where 3 of the sky's brightest stars, Sirius, Aldebaran and Rigel, made their first appearance at dawn each year after a season lost in the sun's glare, an event astronomers call a heliacal rising. The implication was specific and testable against the sky itself. Watching for Aldebaran's pre-dawn return would have signaled that the solstice was only days away. Rigel's return would have marked roughly a lunar month past the solstice. Sirius, roughly a month after that, closing the loop before the deep snows returned. A culture without a written calendar could have used the wheel to count down toward the longest day of the year and to track the turning of the seasons that followed, using nothing but the sky and a set of stones set in place decades or centuries before by people who never lived to see whether their alignment held. A later researcher, the archaeologist Jack Robinson, proposed that yet another cairn pair aligned with the star Fomalhaut, and calculated that the alignment would only have worked during a window of several centuries, a detail that, if accurate, offers one of the few physical clues to when the wheel's spokes were actually laid. None of this resolved the question of the wheel's actual age. A single fragment of wood, recovered decades later from inside one of the cairns and tested using radiocarbon methods, returned a result of no more than roughly 220 years, placing it somewhere in the middle of the 1700s. Researchers were careful to treat that figure as a minimum only, since a piece of wood can become lodged inside a cairn long after the stones around it were first laid. Other lines of evidence point to an age of several centuries at minimum, and the wider landscape around Medicine Mountain shows signs of native use stretching back many thousands of years earlier still, long before the wheel, in whatever form it first took, existed at all. Eddy's paper did not receive an easy reception. Astronomers who reviewed his interdisciplinary approach were skeptical that a plains culture without a written tradition could have achieved this degree of precision, and some archaeologists, in turn, doubted a solar physicist's authority to interpret a site defined as much by ethnography as by stone. The skepticism did not hold for long. Over the following years, Eddy's alignments were checked, debated, and largely accepted within both fields, and his findings were eventually carried into National Geographic and into the broader public record of what is now called North American archaeoastronomy. What had looked, for 70 years, like an oddly placed pile of rocks on an inhospitable summit was reclassified as one of the most sophisticated astronomical instruments identified anywhere on the continent, a status few had thought to consider before Eddy climbed that ridge with instruments built for studying a star 93 million miles away, and found them useful much closer to home. And this is where the written record and the oral tradition, followed independently for most of a century, arrive at the same place without ever having been compared side by side. Eddy's instruments told him the wheel pointed to the sun's extreme positions and to the rising of specific stars. The Crow, using no instruments at all, had called it the Sun's Lodge generations before Eddy was born, and had sent their most respected leaders there to fast and seek guidance for at least as long as anyone could remember. Nobody told them what the alignments meant in the language of solstices and heliacal risings. They had already named the place for what it did. The same pattern surfaces elsewhere in the region's oral record, and it is difficult to set aside once noticed. In the mid-1930s, gold prospectors blasting through rock in a different range of the Wyoming mountains broke into a sealed cave that had no natural opening to the outside world. Inside, seated cross-legged on a stone ledge, its arms folded across its chest, was a mummified form. What science could not explain was the position. Nowhere else in the region has a burial from that era been documented, seated upright, legs crossed, arms deliberately folded, sealed inside solid rock rather than laid in the ground. Whoever placed that body there did so with intention. A second, similarly posed mummy, examined by researchers decades later and nicknamed Chiquita, showed the same unusual arrangement of limbs, reviving the same unanswered question the first discovery had raised. Why prepare a body this way at all, and why seal it inside solid rock rather than commit it to the ground? The reason for that intention has never surfaced. So which is the true anomaly here? A stone wheel, built where nothing can survive 9 months of the year, engineered with an accuracy modern astronomers still find striking more than 2 centuries after its likely construction. A small body, sealed inside solid rock, positioned with a care that suggests ritual rather than accident. Or is the real anomaly simply how much of this land's oldest knowledge was dismissed as folklore, decade after decade, right up until an instrument finally confirmed what had already been said aloud, plainly, for generations? Historians and archaeologists are, in the end, assembling a record out of fragments that were never meant to fit together: a 19th century Hunter's Magazine article, a museum curator's field notes, an anthropologist's transcribed conversation with an elderly informant, a physicist's aligned sightlines published decades later, and a story about a scarred young man who climbed a mountain alone and came back healed. None of these fragments were collected with each other in mind. They simply agree. Perhaps that is the real lesson the wheel offers, that knowledge does not require a single form to be considered real, and that a culture without a written calendar can still leave behind a record precise enough to be independently confirmed by science centuries after it was made. In 1970, the wheel was formally recognized as a National Historic Landmark, a designation later expanded to protect several thousand acres of the surrounding plateau rather than the stone circle alone, in recognition of how much of its significance lies in the land around it rather than in the rocks themselves. The wheel is still used today. More than 60 tribes are known to visit it, leaving cloth offerings and tobacco tied along its perimeter fence. Prayers are still made there for healing and for those who have died, and the site remains closed at times so that ceremonies can continue undisturbed, much as they are said to have continued, without interruption, since long before anyone thought to write any of this down. What is certain is that someone chose that ridge on purpose, for a reason that outlasted them by centuries. What remains uncertain, and may remain that way permanently, is exactly who they were and how they came to know what they knew. This is not the only place on the continent where that pattern has repeated itself, oral tradition arriving first and quietly at a conclusion that instruments would only reach generations later. It may simply be the clearest example we have. Thank you for spending this time with us. If stories like this one, where physical evidence and indigenous memory meet each other on equal footing rather than compete for the last word, are the kind of history you want more of, consider subscribing so the next documentary finds its way to you. And here is the question we want to leave you with. If a monument built without writing can still be read, centuries later, by the sky itself, how much other knowledge have we already dismissed simply because we never thought to look for its instructions somewhere other than a page? I'll see you in the next documentary.